All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we are joined by Amos Fox, a military theorist, author, and a retired U.S. Army officer. Amos, it's great to have you here on the show. And before we jump into today's discussion, could you start by telling us a bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you. Appreciate the invitation to come on the podcast. And yeah, so I'm a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. I was a armor officer, so I know that means different things to different people, different nationalities and whatnot, different armies. So that's tanks and cavalry in the U.S. Army. So I spent the preponderance of my career in tank units. I spent the last 3 years of my career working at Army Futures Command as a concept developer, working on the Army concept for 2040. So thinking about the future and working on the concept, the Army warfighting concept, to bring that future to today. And then I'm currently I don't know why I said that. I'm currently a professor of practice at Arizona State University within the School of Politics and Global Studies and the Future Security Initiative. And I teach there at Arizona State, and as part of that also, Arizona State owns Small Wars Journal, so I'm the managing editor for Small Wars Journal. And then I also work as a lecturer at the University of Houston, where I teach international relations and strategy. And then I'm also a contributing editor at War on the Rocks. I co-host 2 podcasts within the Soldier Pulse podcast and the Warcast podcast. And then I also host, separate from all that, my own podcast, Revolution and Military Affairs. So that's me, and that's what I do.
You don't sound busy at all.
Not at all. I'm also writing 2 books.
Well, we're so happy to have you with us, Amos, and we very interested in your first book, and we hope to get into a bit of a discussion about your future books too.
Yeah.
You know, as we crack on.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Let's get going then.
That sounds good. How do you find that your experience as a serving soldier and officer contributed to your research, Amos?
So being in the Army was completely intertwined with trying to understand war and warfare and strategy. I was, I don't know, fortunate or unfortunate is the correct way to say it, but I got to participate in the war in Iraq many, many times. I guess both wars in Iraq, 2 of the 3, if you consider Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Inherent Resolve, distinct and separate wars. I was in 2 of those. So I was in OIF and OIR, so the last 2. And I did 2 deployments in Iraq in 2005 to 6, and then I did 1 deployment in 2005 to 2006, and then another in 2008 to 2009 for Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then I did another with OIR in 2017 to 18. And so when I was there in 2005 to 2006, I was there for the best part of the war, when the wheels really came off the wagon and the insurgency started to go off the rails, and you could feel it around you just burning to the ground. And it seemed like no matter what you did, you weren't doing something right. And the insurgency just continued to grow. And then it seemed like all we were tasked to do was drive around and get blown up and then hope that you made it back every day okay. And so that really was the impetus for me to start thinking about what is military thought? Why is it what it is? And how can I contribute to military thought to help make it better, so that people such as myself in the future aren't sitting in a Humvee driving around getting blown up while things around them are just burning to the ground.
You mentioned how by 2008 things had improved on the ground, less chaos, fewer daily threats, and a lot of this was due to political shifts, deals with militias, and external factors. So looking at it from your perspective, do you think that these changes were a result of genuine adaptation within the military, or was it more about external events shaping the battlefield with the doctrine and strategy staying largely the same?
Yeah, so the first time I was in Iraq, and to a lesser degree the second time, I really thought, like, our doctrine is not working. What we're saying about what we're doing isn't actually reality. The doctrine we have is insufficient. The things that seem to be coming into the intellectual pool of how to address the situation seem insufficient. We're looking more to find ways to legitimize and justify our doctrine and our procurement strategies, as opposed to, what is the reality of the situation? How can we approach that from realistic situations and realistic strategies to make forward progress, instead of just saying, we're doing all right and our doctrine's pretty good. If we just keep doing this, things will work out our way. And so that was really something that when I was younger, not even when I was younger, all the way up to this very moment, rubbed me the wrong way, and so that was one of my goals with when I started writing, was that when I was in Iraq in 2005, 2006, so I got there in November of 2005 and I left in November of 2006 the first time. And again, it was just complete chaos when the mosque in Samarra was bombed, and I think it was December of 2005. It really just, things went off the rails, and I may be off on the date. It may have been February 2006, but somewhere in that window. Once spring rolled around, it was chaos and game on. And then you could also see the EFP, the explosively formed penetrator, slowly moving its way into the theater during that time. And we would do updates every night. I was a lieutenant at the time, and we'd have company updates with our company commander, and he'd provide an intel update on things that were going on. And everybody was completely horrified of that thing, because we had no way to stop it. Zero, right? This is before we had V-bodied trucks, before MRAPs, before anything like that. And so if your truck hit an EFP, chance was the only thing that was going to get you out of that situation alive. Not anything we were doing, right? And it wasn't our tactics. There was nothing. We'd come up with some hodgepodge, rudimentary things to try and work around it, some techniques on the battlefield to try and mitigate the effect of that. But by and large, there was nothing we could do. And so that was one thing that horrified us, right? And so you basically just crossed your fingers and every day hope that you made it back all right. And then every day when you got back, you'd be like, oh man, look, I'm intact, Sometimes your buddies weren't, and sometimes you would bargain with yourself, before you rolled out the gate that morning. Like, what am I okay losing? If I lost a leg, would I be okay with that? If I lost my arm, would I be okay with that? If I came back with TBI to where I can't hold a job later in life, would I be okay with that? And so that really, for me, was one of the big, huge things that impacted the way that I approach thinking about military thought and critiquing it the way that I do. Because I know sometimes I've ruffled some feathers, at least in the U.S. Army, because of that. And that's fine with me, because at the end of the day, I'm not about rubber stamping institutional preferences for how to fight war. I'm about fighting wars effectively and correctly based off the situation. So there's that. Now, to the other part of your question, when I went back to Iraq in 2008, things had gotten significantly better. We had actually, there were many factors that contributed to it, like the Sons of Iraq that went off in Anbar. That was one thing that helped stabilize the Sunni insurgency that was going on. There were some handshake deals with a lot of the Iranian-aligned Shia militia groups in southern Iraq that was going on as well that, tamped down some of that violence. Like we had a don't mess with Muqtada al-Sadr's group thing going on, which meant that they didn't mess with us, and there was a lot of that happened also. There was, many, many other factors that go into it, so I'm oversimplifying. But by and large, the security situation on the ground was vastly different when I went back in 2008. And you could feel it. It felt totally different. You didn't feel nearly as threatened every day. And part of that too was my job was different. I wasn't driving around every day, doing missions on the ground. I was working on a battalion staff at that time, so that was part of it. But also at the same time, things were far less dangerous. So there was that. And then in 2017, 18, it was completely different conflict. The whole war was totally different. The parties fighting the war, not totally different, but just different. And so, we had a completely different mission though. And that one, that was, we, the U.S. and our friends, our partners, the allies, the coalition, were supporting the government of Iraq this time and fighting the Islamic State. And that in itself is a whole nother discussion, but that was essentially a U.S.-led proxy war against the Islamic State, using the Iraqis as a proxy, as that intermediate conduit war fighting element on the ground where we were just behind them. In some cases, not very far at all. but behind them conceptually, providing them with the resources they need to fight the Islamic State. And so that was another eye-opening thing for me. So I did my PhD on proxy war. And when I was standing there in Baghdad one day, and I say the PhD part to get to this, I was standing there one day, and one of the guys that was he worked in the J33, the current ops section, and the JOC, and the Joint Operations Center. He came in. I worked in the J5, the plan section, and I was the campaign manager for the campaign for the SJFLC, the Joint Land Component Command Headquarters, so the land component of the fight. And he had said, "Man, we're fighting this proxy war. This is wild." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Proxy war?" I hadn't thought much about proxy war before he had said that. And then that conversation was what got me sitting right here, right now with a PhD, with my focus on proxy war. My studies focused on proxy war, and I've written a ton of stuff since then on proxy war. And I immediately started working on some conceptual framing of, is this a proxy war? What's a proxy war? Let me flesh this out and figure this out. And so, I published an article when I got home in Military Review on proxy war and how, the U.S. is fighting those proxy wars. And one of the big things that I had found was that we weren't well suited for proxy war because we didn't talk about proxy war and doctrine, right? And so you send guys over there to go prosecute may not be the right word or the best word in this situation, but, conduct this proxy war. And again, proxy is not a pejorative. It's not a bad thing. It's not slighting the person that's doing the fighting for you. Because we don't like the term, we've built this negative connotation around it, but it's not. It's just defining a relationship, right? And if you're not doing the fighting, but somebody else is doing the fighting for you, well, by virtue of that relationship, they're the proxy and you're the principal, And so a big part of the issue, though, that I found was that we didn't understand the relationship, and we continue. And this is another thing in the J5 that was very instrumental to me. One of the deputy commanding generals, this British guy we had, comes in one day, and this is after Mosul had fallen, right? And then after we found that the Islamic State was not going to fight, because we thought after Mosul they were going to go into Tal Afar, and we were going to have another mini Mosul, just like we had. In Tal Afar, like we had in Mosul. And that didn't happen. And then once that didn't happen, the Iraqis really quit listening to a lot of what we said, And they started taking back agency, right? This is part of the phenomenon of proxy war. Proxy is no longer, the principle is no longer needed in a transactional proxy relationship. The proxy will start distancing themselves from the principle to the best of their ability, right? And so we saw that with the Iraqis. And so the DCG comes in one day and he's all worked up. And he tells my buddy that worked right next to me, he said, "Hey, so-and-so, I want you to come up with a carrots and sticks scale that we can use with the Iraqis to take things away from them if they quit listening to what we tell them to do, right?" And so it was like this sliding scale of how well are the Iraqis listening in relation to what are we going to take away from them, right? And so one of the big things that we were going to take away was ISR and armed ISR, and long-range precision strike. And so that was but those two conversations really were like two of the biggest things in my mind that got me going on this proxy war appreciation that I started developing, but then also how insufficient U.S. military doctrine was for understanding proxy war. And then that gets to the book. So a lot of the stuff I talk about in the book and a lot of things I've written before the book and I'm writing now address shortcomings in contemporary Western military thinking, because we have these normative values baked into our doctrine, and it's fine. IHL should always be at the fore, but IHL doesn't necessarily preclude you from including things that are realities, and proxy war is reality. Attritional warfare is a reality, positional warfare is a reality. Urban warfighting, sieges, these things are all realities that have to be addressed.
If you're dialed in, drop us a review on your app. Watching on YouTube, hit subscribe to join the conversation. All right, back to it.
That was a very comprehensive answer, Amos. And I want to build on that. You mentioned rubber stamping pre-existing doctrine or doctrinal approaches, maybe theories. And in the recent past, there's been a lot of focus, especially in the West, on maneuver warfare, maneuver theory, maybe air-land battle. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, that has become everything to every man. And maybe it's also a synonym just for good practice and for common sense at times. And also simple solutions, perhaps with streamlined forces. It meets some sort of political, the boys will be back by December, or the forces will be back by December kind of thing. So you have written and no doubt thought a lot about this. And can you maybe give us a few lines, just about how you started tackling these various theories and your counterpoints to them?
Yeah. So again, I think there's institutions don't want to be perceived as illegitimate or wrong. And so instead of saying, my bad, maybe we were lacked comprehensiveness in this, in this set of training that we provided you before you deployed, or in the strategy that we've, put forward for, how to address the situation, or the fact that we completely misread the strategic situation, and that the Iraqis weren't going to greet us as liberators when we showed up, and that there was actually going to be this big backlash and an insurgency. Or, if you look at Russia, Ukraine, that once forces converge on one another, there really isn't any room to do maneuver. And so we have to have different ways of thinking.
Sure.
So, those types of things really, to me, come to the fore when I think about a lot of this. And I think that there's a lot of, institutions don't want to be wrong. They don't want to have wasted the money and the resources that they put forward into developing their ways of thinking about how to do war fighting. Yeah, so for the maneuver aspect in particular, first off, a lot of what, sorry, I'm bringing out a notepad now, so I make sure I jot down the parts here so I don't forget the second parts of your question.
It's bad form on our side for doing two-part questions, right?
No, it's all good.
HR's against it these days.
No, yeah, that's fine. No, okay, so for maneuver, it's, you're right. It's one of those things that's become everything to everybody, right? So if something's good, it's maneuver, and if something's bad, it's not maneuver, right? And part of that too is the maneuver is based off really bad, I don't even want to call it theory, bad narratives over the course of the late 70s, early 80s, and then early to mid 90s. And so if you go back, so I'm working on a book right now for Bloomsbury called Maneuvers Dead, and I wrote a paper in Rusi Journal. It's been probably a couple of years now, and it was Maneuvers Dead ? But this book I've removed the question mark, and it's just Maneuvers Dead. And I borrowed that phrase. I didn't come up with that on my own. I borrowed that actually from Tony King. Now he's at Exeter. He's the big urban war studies scholar. And he had said it in a podcast, a Rusi podcast with Peter Roberts several years ago now. And I thought it was terrific because I love the way he was emphatic about it. And he said it not with a question mark, but with a period. And so anyhow, I had borrowed that phrase from him, and I footnote him every time I use it. But I borrowed that phrase from him because it gets people's attention, right? When you say that, people get riled up either for or against it, depending on which side of the aisle they fall in. But I say all that to say, if you go back and look at the pedigree of maneuver as we understand it today, it's based on some really just bad junk, I don't even want to call it pseudoscience, pseudo-theory, just bad narrative, right? And so folks always want to go back and reference Richard Simpkins' The Race to the Swift. But if you read that and you crack it open, it's just unfounded assertions that have no basis in anything other than his opinion, right? And so there's that, right? So just there's no credible evidence to support anything that he says other than him saying it, right? Same thing, too, if you go back and look at William Lynn's Maneuver Warfare Handbook, very much the same thing. Or the things that he does cite is German generals post-World War II, who a lot of which are trying to either reconcile what they did during the war with the fact that they made it out and didn't get strung up on the hangman's noose at the end of the war, or trying to, rehabilitate their image, or trying to make themselves look better than what they might necessarily have otherwise been. And so you've got that. Then also, if you look at Edward Lutwack's book, Strategy, I forget the full name of the book, but it was I think early 90s book as well. I've got it on my bookshelf over there. I just can't see it from this far. But it's same. It's very similar to Simpkins' book. It's just trust me for who I am and don't dig into what I'm saying any further than the footnotes that may or may not exist. And so that's one of the things when I look at these things that these people have written, I go to your footnotes or your endnotes and I say, okay, what did you base this off of? And for the maneuver side of the house, it's very, very weak evidence to support any of it, right? Whereas you can go look at things on attrition, right? And Trevor Dupuy, I always forget how to pronounce his last name, because we had a General Dupuy, so I think it's Dupuy. But Trevor Dupuy, who was a retired Army colonel, and then after that, he had run a small think tank, the Dupuy Institute. He had run that for a long time. It still carries on very, very marginally today. But he had empirically supported evidence for many of the things, all the things that he wrote, because he did a think tank work and he'd supplied, the Pentagon with reports and this and that. And so you can get his books. He's got a book called On Attrition. I don't know that I have all of Dupuy's books, but I have many, many of his books. And if you dig into those, it's empirical data, right? And empirical data is also obviously can be very biased. I'm not saying his is or isn't. I'm just saying it can be. So I say that knowing that empirical evidence can be biased. But you look at that, and he has data to support the assertions that he makes about warfare and warfighting. And he doesn't say maneuver's the best. He just says, hey, these are the things that data shows, right? And so I always appreciated Dupuy's approach to that. And I don't do quantitative analysis. I prefer qualitative over that because I think it helps to illustrate with stories more so than charts and math and numbers, especially to people that read military theory today, who are far more interested in reading paragraphs than they are looking at, weird math equations and tables of data. So there's that. And so that's one, just maneuver in particular. That's one of the reasons that I've basically turned my mind, because it was really, for me, it was a journey. I as an armor officer, as a tanker, I was always, I grew up in the cult of maneuver, and that was the way you were supposed to do things. And then when I was a tank company commander and my executive officer, I was chatting with him after a National Training Center rotation one time, and he's like, hey, the stuff you're saying sounds very much like this guy in this book that I read once. It's called Fighting by Minutes by Robert Leonard. He's like, you should pick it up and see what you think. And so I got it, and that was really what got me going on studying military theory and military thinking, was reading Robert Leonard's Fighting by Minutes. And so that was where I got started on all this. And that was, I would sit at the time, shortly after that, because I was stationed at Fort Oro on the National Training Center. After that, I went to Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, and that's where the armor school had recently relocated to. And so while I was there, I would just go to the library on post and pull out all these books and read all this book about maneuver warfare and the theory behind it and the thinking behind it. And as I started digging more, I started realizing that it was based off bunk nonsense, essentially. And I was like, hey, wait a second. What they're telling us is not necessarily factual. And so, just tackling maneuver, to get back to you, just tackling maneuver, that's how, I approached that. And it was accidental, because I'm one of those people that likes to, I like to know why things are the way they are. Like, I'll endorse it all day long if I believe in what it's based on. And then as I started looking into maneuver, I realized, hey, it's based on vapor.
That's quite interesting. Sweden actually moved away from traditional maneuver warfare in the early 2000s as the military shifted focus towards peacekeeping and lighter expeditionary forces.
Yeah.
But after 2014, and now especially with NATO, we've been kind of reintroducing the maneuver concepts, almost like we're following trends rather than having a clear doctrinal foundation. And now there's a big push for maneuver again.
That's part of the problem with NATO, right? Is that it's killed all these unique ways of war that other states, other countries used to have, and it added nuance and wrinkle to the bigger approach to warfare. If you look at warfare, big picture, there used to be all these different schools: the Russian school, the German school, the French school, the Swedish school. I mean, hell, the Swedes taught the West how to fight war anyway, right? If we go far enough back, and by everybody being a part of NATO today, because it really is almost everybody in the West at this point, Western Europe, everybody has to essentially adopt U.S. Army, U.S. military doctrine and joining NATO because, the U.S.'s military doctrine, fortunately, unfortunately, whichever way you want to look at that, is the foundation of NATO doctrine. And so it eliminates a lot of the nuance that's needed to understand war more holistically and more completely by homogenizing, right? Bringing it all together and just carving away all the nice little the nuances and edges that exist out there. And it's I think it's a disservice because it's going to set us on a path to where we get into these a fictitious conflict. We get into this conflict and then we're find ourselves with situations that we don't know how to address. And 20 years ago, Sweden was the expert in how to address that, and now we've made Sweden look like us being the U.S. in this case, and we've lost the expertise that may have existed within the coalition to address those problems.
Yes, I definitely agree, and I think Sweden has a role to play here too. As a new NATO member, there is this kind of eagerness to align with doctrine and all of that, but hopefully we can bring something to the table rather than just adopting to everything wholesale. We had our own ways of thinking about warfare, and I think it would be a loss if we just abandoned that expertise. But speaking of shifting doctrines, in your book, Conflict Realism, it touches on another kind of key element to warfare, and that's sieges.
Yeah.
You mentioned it earlier, but I would love to hear more about how sieges remain relevant today, because it's so easy to think of them as a thing of the past, pretty old school, but they keep showing up in modern conflicts. And how do you see sieges evolving, and could you give us some recent examples?
Yeah, so I think a key thing to understand about sieges is A, they're 100% relevant. B, this is where people get tripped up. Siege warfare, and this is part of the problem, like lexicon terminology, and people always just refer back to the terms that they're most comfortable with. But siege warfare isn't useful, right? Because then that conjures up these images of trebuchets and ballistas and, people trying to cross moats and batter down walls. That's not what sieges are today. There's several different types of sieges, and I talk about it in the book, that play out today. And by type, I mean, if, I group them based off observable pattern. But siege itself is very relevant. And this is another situation where, going back to my time in Iraq on Sundays, on my last deployment, I worked at the JFLIC headquarters in the J5, and on Sundays, we didn't have to come in until noon or 1. So they gave us a little break in the morning, right? And so in those mornings, I would reflect on the things that I had been experiencing over the course of the war while I was there. And inevitably, when I start reflecting, I start writing. And so I'd published the initial paper that I published on sieges, which was published through AUSA, the Association of the United States Army, or it may have still been called the Land Power Institute because it changed. It was the Land Power Institute, but it was by AUSA, but then they just got rid of Land Power Institute and just said AUSA. So I don't remember exactly which banner it's published under right now, but while I was there, while I was in Iraq, I published that paper, and it came out while I was in Iraq, which was funny. But I was sitting there in Baghdad looking around like, all right, so we just had Mosul. That was a siege. There was various elements of siege to that on both sides. And then I looked across the border in Syria, and there were several sieges going on in Syria, right? You had Kobani, you had Aleppo, you had Raqqa, right? And these were all, at the time, either still going on while I was there, or B, had just finished up. And so, again, sieges going on there. And then I'd done, when I was in the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, SAMS, I had written my monograph. You have to write a master's thesis while you're there. You get a master's degree when you walk out of there, if you complete everything. It's not a show up and do it thing. But I did my master's thesis in SAMS on the Russo-Ukrainian War, and I did it under the banner of hybrid warfare. And I had a Ukrainian officer in my class too. And it's funny, at the end of the course, he pulls me over one day and he's like, "Hey, Amos, come here, look at this." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool, what are you showing me?" And he pulls up this table, and it's like a wire diagram of the first and second, what are they called now? The first and second armies, right? So the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Armies. And it's a wire diagram of this thing. and where everything's located and everything you'd want to know. And I'm like, first, I'm like, bro, why you got that on your personal computer? You know? Second, why are you showing me this at the end of the course? You knew I was working on this monograph the whole year. You know, I could have used that information months ago. And so anyhow, I say that to say there were sieges that occurred in 2014, 2015, right? So you go back and you look at, and again, this is where there's different types of sieges, but if you look at the Battle of Ilovaisk, that was a siege. You look at Donetsk Airport, that was a siege. If you look at the Battle of Debaltseve in early 2015, that was a siege, right? Fast forward in time, and this is part of what I had identified when you look at patterns, right? So I think if, like as analysts, theorists, whatever we want to call ourselves, scholars, you got to look for patterns, right? And so patterns develop in how Russia fights wars. And so I'd published some stuff. I'd published a paper that actually came out in Small Wars and Insurgencies just after the war in Russia had reinvaded Ukraine in 2022. But it had been written, you know how academic publishing is. It was written like a year before. It just had not floundered, but slowly worked its way through the system that it came out just a little too late. And I said, hey, man, like if Russia comes back, expect to see sieges, right? And it just happened to be when this, Mariupol is going down. And so you look at, Russia's invasion in 2022, which is just a continuation of what I call the Donbass campaign, right? Sieges, again, came to play a very important part in the early phases of that reinvasion, or that 2022 period of invasion. And again, folks looked around shocked, and they're like, oh my God, can you believe there's a siege going on in Mariupol? And I thought to myself, and I said to people, yes, I can believe it, because that's a modern Russian way of warfare. And ironically, I had gotten invited to a conference at Harvard University there in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a few months before everything got going in Russia, or in Ukraine with Russia. And it was a conference on sieges. And it was hosted by the Harvard Law School, plus the Lieber Institute, which is focused on international and humanitarian law out of West Point, New York, the U.S. Military Academy, and then the ICRC, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, right? And so it was these three elements that were hosting this conference. And then because I was one of the only people that had written about sieges, contemporary sieges and war, I was like the token Army guy that wasn't a lawyer, because there was several Army guys that were lawyers there, but I was the token combat arms guy that was there. And I actually, I spoke a ton throughout this conference, right? Because I was like one of the only people that could get up and start talking about it. Hey, this is really going on, and here's how it looks. And it was fascinating because you had lawyers from the ICRC, and no offense to lawyers nor the ICRC, but they were just, droning on about how things ought to be. And I was like, okay, I hear what you're saying, bro, but that's not how things are, And they had this crazy conception about lawyers in Army units. And I was like, lawyers exist at the brigade level and above. The fighting elements of armies are the brigade level and below, right? And so that lawyer is only touching that brigade commander. And everybody else has to have just had good training on international humanitarian law and know the law of armed conflict well enough to not violate, the things that are held within there. And so it was just this fascinating conversation, because there was this massive disconnect between where lawyers exist and don't exist, and how real lawyers that work in real places don't appreciate that chasm. And so anyway, sieges, yeah, alive and well all over the place. Marawi was also another one that was going on at that time. It had just finished the U.S. Philippine fight against the Islamic State in the Philippines, right? That big battle was essentially a siege of Marawi. And the other thing with that too, the part that people really don't want to talk about, you think people don't want to talk about sieges, the part they really don't want to talk about is that the death, damage, and destruction that they bring is astronomical, right? And we do sieges, we did many sieges, and everybody else does them too. And so again, if you look at Mosul after the fact, I forget the dollar amount, but it was like $3 billion worth of destruction, not to count the almost 1 million people that had been displaced, plus the thousands that had been killed in trying to reclaim that city from the Islamic State, right? And that was something that we tried to do, adhering to international humanitarian law. And so this is where I think part of the equation that's not actually stated and correctly comes into play, and that is your opponent doesn't care how you want to fight. Your opponent also, first and foremost, is going to fight you in a way that furthers their survival, right? And so if that means ensconcing themselves within an urban area and fighting defensively and making you take every single block along the way, they're going to do that, right? They're not going to just come out and say, hey, here I am, kill me. It's not like the predator, when he's trying to lure the predator into that little murder hole he's got made, and he's like, hey, here I am, kill me. Your enemy's not doing that. And if they are, guess what? It's probably a trap, just like Arnold had set for the predator. And so I think that's important to consider when we think about this. And this is part of the reason, too, when I say we're shocked at the byproduct. We were shocked at the end of Mosul, that Mosul looked the way that it did. We shouldn't have been shocked. That should be a part of doctrine. Sieges should be a part of doctrine. This is what it is. This is how they generally are, they are generally done. These are the, whatever it is now, I forget. I think I expanded it to 6 types. I initially had 4. I think I've expanded it to 6 types of sieges you can expect to see. And in doing those, these are the effects that you can expect to see on the back end. Whether you're the one doing the siege or you're on the siege, you're the besieged actor. The effect from this characterization of a siege is going to be this. And again, knowing that is just a rough approximation based off, observable fact over time, historical observations over time, and that not every situation will play that way. But that's the thing that I think is overlooked with all this is, your opponent wants to live, and they're going to fight you in a way that advances their being able to continue to live, which is why, urban warfare has become so much more of a thing. And as a byproduct of urban warfare becoming much more of a thing, sieges are becoming much more of a thing. So I could riff on for like another 45 minutes on sieges, but I'll go ahead and hand it back to you guys.
If you ever thought, these guys, they deserve a drink, you're not wrong. Buy us a beer at undergroundstrategy.com/support. Fuel the banter, fund the strategy. Cheers. Back to the action.
Amos, when you said that, I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. Firstly, how it's a continuity of war, always has been.
Oh, yeah.
And then secondly, the way that opposing fighting forces think about war, because the let's say the fighting forces, the warriors, the soldiers who you mentioned now, who are taking cover and then later on being besieged, they don't necessarily think about this in these high theoretical terms, right? They're just thinking like in real practical, I got to get this done, I got to survive.
Yeah.
And this is just a side note almost for myself, like thinking out aloud. And then how a big military institution then processes thoughts and concepts, and how long it takes to change, to analyze, and then to disseminate and, have some sort of change management process. It's just a side thought for myself, really, not even a question. But just when you were saying, when you made a really compelling argument about it's a continuity, it should be considered from tactics, techniques, procedures, all the way up in terms of strategic thinking. So you said it really well. And while you were saying it, it just kind of like, I was like, yeah, it's some of these things which is obvious once you've said it, but in the moment, we as humans, we make mistakes. Now that I've managed to completely just say a lot of words with making little sense, I want to just touch on another theme that's in your book, Conflict Realism, and you bring it out. It's to do with the importance of military theory and military theorists. And in the introduction or in the foreword, Major General Ryan, he mentions this, and that how military theorists perhaps don't occupy this important space. You've touched on it earlier in this talk, why military theorists are important, but perhaps you could just give us unpack a little bit more about why they remain key to military affairs.
Yeah, so I think today, especially, military theorists represent the independent check on learning, if you will, for institutionalized military thought and academic international relations thinking, right? And so international relations basically took over the role of the military theorist in the post-Cold War, or in the post-World War II era, right? So that's when we get Schelling. That's where you get all these guys starting to come to the fore, and they're thinking about, Cold War, nuclear war primarily. And that international relations field really begins to develop, emerge, and become a big thing. And again, as somebody that teaches IR and teaches strategy in IR, you can make the argument that Thucydides was the first IR scholar, right? I got it. That's fine. But by and large, it's generally accepted that, that field emerged then, right? And then at the same time, we start seeing the outgrowth of institutionalized structure for military thought around the same time. And it really, in the U.S. military, really becomes set in stone with the establishment of training and doctrine command, right? And that was set up by General William Depew. We're back to him in the I believe it was the late 70s. And TRADOC is what it's called. So I'm going to use shorthand because that's how I often, that's how I'm just trained to say the word. But TRADOC was developed, right? And that took all the stuff that was being done all over the place and just put it right there in the middle of, a 4-star Army headquarters. So you have those two features that happen, right? And it's almost like this convergence of arcs. You've got these two things going up at the same time, and then at the same time, you basically have Liddell Hart, dying. You have JFC Fuller dying shortly before that. And then you don't have any more military theorists, right? You've got Trevor Dupuy out there going along till the early 90s. And then you've got a couple of other legitimate theorists who actually deal with things. And again, like Fuller and Hart, they have their foibles. I completely get it. But, they were doing more than most as it related to military theory. And so you had military theorists dying off or going away and being replaced by IR scholars and by institutionalized military thinking around the same time. And so I say that to say you don't have this independent, just person that cares for caring out there offering another perspective. Institutions are fundamentally going to advance whatever their institutional flavor of the day happens to be, right? So like today, the Army introduces MDO, and now everybody's like, MDO is the greatest thing, multi-domain operations. The Army introduces multi-domain operations, and everybody now is like, oh, MDO is the greatest thing in the world. And we've got to fight this away. We've got to create our own multi-domain task forces and think about fighting light, small, and dispersed with long-range precision strike, and fighting in that way, as opposed to people being like, what, this MDO thing may not be all it is, and there might be better ways to approach this. And this is the other book. I said I have 2 books that I'm working on. This is the other book. I'm working on a book on MDO with Howgate Publishing, who published Conflict Realism, and Franz Stefan Gotti's the co-editor. So this is an edited book where we've brought in all sorts of people to help us work on this problem. We've got 21 contributors, or 21 chapters, and some of those chapters have co-authors too. So there's actually about probably 30 people working on this. And the whole idea is to offer a counter argument to, it's not saying MDO is wrong, it's just counter perspectives and counter arguments and counter ways of thinking, in addition to providing some of the people that helped develop the concept from concept and turn it into doctrine that are contributing on that book. And so that, I think, is why theorists, the individuals, the human beings, are important, because they offer counterballast to institutional proclivities for whatever it is. And again, institutions are informed by a lot of things. Reality is only one element of that, and it may actually be a very small element. It could also be defense industry that says, hey, we've got these cool things that we want you to buy. And having worked at Army Futures Command and worked on developing the concept for 2040, I can assure you that that is a huge part of what's going into concepts and reality and things from contemporary conflict. It's factored in, but it's factored in to a far smaller degree than the big push from people with deeper pockets.
That's a really interesting point, Amos. And this is the institutional influence on military thinking, especially with the defense industry involvement, is something that we see play out in real time with the Russian-Ukraine war. There is this cycle of adopting and refining doctrines based on what fits procurement needs rather than purely on battlefield realities.
Yeah.
And while we're speaking on evolving approaches to warfare, I want to touch on something we have been circling around throughout this discussion, and that is urban warfare. You've had a significant first-hand experience in Iraq, and you've also examined it extensively from a theoretical perspective. How do you see the relationship between those two, your practical experience and the theoretical framework? Have your views on urban warfare shifted over time as a result of this?
Yeah. I try to, my approach, I try and align my theoretical work as best I can to practical experience, either myself or those of others. Because again, if theory is not useful, if it's not tied to historical precedent, then it's not really useful, right? And so I've always tried to link those two and make them something that feed off one another and feed the other, right? And so from the practical side, it's almost hard, especially at the level that I was at early on, to make any sense of any of it, because you're just there on the ground, running around, trying not to get blown up or shot, right? And so it's just pure chaos. But my last deployment when I was in Iraq, it's a JFLIC OAR. I worked in the J5 in the plan section, and so I really could just sit and survey what was going on, right, and look at the data that was coming in and see what was going on. And like I said, I could look over at Syria and see what was going on. And again, that's practical experience, but it's a vastly different degree. We're working at a land component command headquarters versus being a lieutenant on the ground, running around, doing all the things. It's significantly different. And so you got a lot more time to like reflect, analyze the data, think about what was going on, like see the data, pull the data, right? And make deductions about causality between, if we do this thing, what are they going to do? Okay, they're going to do that, right? So it's like I said too, your opponent's not going to fight you the way that you think they're going to fight. So as a lieutenant on the ground, you don't necessarily see that. You just see that you're getting shot at, right? Or you're getting blown up. But you don't understand that, like, the reason that they're in that building or the reason they've strung these IEDs in the road is, from a defensive, strategic or operationally defensive mindset where, hey, if I come out and fight you outright, we're gonna get killed real quick, real easy. And that was one of the things too, as I said, I was there when the insurgency started really unraveling. A common thing that was said during that time that I heard often, and I may have even said it myself, because again, as good combat arms officers, you want to beat your chest and talk about how tough you are. It was always, why don't they just come out and fight us, right? Like, clearly we're, better than them. Well, yeah, dude, that's the point. That's why they're not coming out and fighting you. They're outthinking you. They're fighting you, in a smarter way than what you're trying to fight them. They're causing you to have to solve 10 problems when they have to solve 2, right? They're making it far more challenging for you. And so that, to me, was something that I missed early on when we talk about practical experience that I appreciated later when I was when I was working in Baghdad, watching Mosul, because I was there for like the last 2 months of the Battle of Mosul. And when I looked over at Syria, same thing. When I reflected on what I had written about when I did my studies on the Russia-Ukraine war of 2014, 2015, I was able to see that far more clearly. And then another thing that I think is important too, like it was an eye-opening thing for me, was I really started getting into systems theory and looking at thinking about things through the lens of systems. And there's a really good book. It's called, I think it's called Systems Thinking, a Primer. It was written by Danilo Meadows. And it's terrific. It's amazing. It's one of the best books I've ever read, and it's foundational to how I think about how adversaries interact, and not just adversaries, but anybody interacts with anybody. And it really, and this is, I teach this, this book's part of the course I teach in strategy and international relations too. The first rule of any contest or competitive environment is don't die, right? And the second rule is if you don't die, then try and win. And so, like, when I think about urban warfare from practical to theoretical, that's the overarching theme that binds those two. Is the first rule is don't die. The second rule is if you're not dying, try and win, right? And there's Meadows, I mentioned her book on systems thinking, systems theory. That's, to me, the best, but there's a bunch. There's one by a German guy that was written, I forget, decades ago. I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try. I tried once on a podcast with Franz Steffengatti, who's Austrian and speaks German, and I tried to say the name in German as best I could and totally butchered it and got clowned by Franz. So I've since refused to try and say German names publicly unless they're really easy. Same thing with German terms. I tried to say Bewegungskrieg with him in that conversation, and it did not turn out well. So anyhow, systems thinking, systems theory is a huge part of that for me. And so I think systems thinking, the way that systems operate, really reflects itself in the hows and whys and the causalities of urban warfare as well. And one of the key things with that too is, you've got the don't die or survive, don't die, and then try and win. And those approaches that you see emerge from that are reflected there. And then a quick note too, because systems thinking, systems theory developed a bad rap, rightfully so, in the 90s and early 2000s, right? So if we think back to John Worden's theory, the 5 rings theory, which was based on systems theory, that theory was incorrectly based on systems theory because he viewed the human body, he used the human body as the metaphor to explain the system, but he did so in an incorrect way because he basically described the human body, but described the system through the lens of a closed system. And none of this operates in closed system fashion, right? We are all open adaptive systems to varying degrees. Now, I think you can find authoritarian regimes are not as open nor adapt. Well, they may be more adaptive sometimes, but not as open, certainly, right? And so like North Korea, that may be very close to a closed system, but I would say probably based off their combat experience that they're gaining right now in Ukraine, that system may be opening up a bit more because you have to, because it goes back to the rules, right? Survive and then win if you can survive. And so I just say, like, I know some folks may be like, oh man, systems thinking, systems theory, like that. I got it. I understand. I get it too. Same thing with effects-based operations. That was also a negative spinoff of systems thinking and systems theory, right? General Mattis ended up killing effects-based operations as the foundation of U.S. joint military doctrine in the early 2000s because he hated it, and he hated systems thinking and systems theory as it related to how it was transmitted into U.S. military doctrine. So, like, I completely, like, that criticism, I get it, but like any good theorist, I get it. I understand it better than everybody else, so I can be the muse to... that's a joke, by the way. But, so I think that's a key part. And so that's really, for me, one of the things that really helps me when I think about conflict and competition and, the back and forth is systems thinking. And that's like an anchor point. There's a couple of anchors in my view of the world as it relates to conflict, and that's systems thinking is one of them.
That's a good answer. And you had me, I was on mute, but you had me giggling away over here.
And that, my friends, that concludes part 1 of our chat with Amos Fox. And we will be back with this beast of masterclass next week. So see you then. Bye-bye.